forbidden fruit, and sacred trees. Axis, transgression, and the feminine threshold. Across ancient mythologies, trees serve not merely as flora but as cosmic anchors, symbolic loci of divine order, hidden knowledge, and mortal transgression. The sacred tree motif predates the Garden of Eden by millennia, appearing in the mythologies of Sumer, Akkad, and early Mesopotamian civilization. These trees are never passive. They are contested spaces. Within them dwell feminine forces, serpentine beings, and forbidden truths. The biblical tree of the knowledge of good and evil is but the latest version of a much older axis mundi, a vertical bridge between mortal existence and divine insight. This section excavates two of the most direct and foundational antecedents to the Edenic tree myth, the Huluppu Tree of Sumer and the Tree of Immortality in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Huluppu Tree, Inanna, Lilith, and the Contested Garden. Primary source: The Tale of Inanna and the Huluppu Tree, Sumerian, circa 2000 BCE. In the earliest strata of Mesopotamian mythopoetics, the tale of Inanna and the Huluppu Tree presents a liminal scene of order confronting disorder, of civilization contending with what Jung might call the shadow of the feminine unconscious. A Huluppu tree, dislodged from its natural riverbank by the Euphrates floods, is rescued and transplanted by Inanna into her sacred garden in Uruk. The tree, intended to be fashioned into a throne and a bed, symbols not merely of sovereignty and intimacy, but of the integration of power, throne, and eros, bed, becomes inhabited by three beings. A serpent nesting in the roots, Chthonic wisdom, instinct. The bird Anzu in the branches, celestial sovereignty, pride. Lilith dwelling in the trunk, liminal erotic autonomy. Unable to expel these interlopers, Inanna, herself a goddess of love, war, and transformation, summons the masculine principle embodied in Gilgamesh, who violently restores order by driving the trio from the tree. The dialectic of the Huluppu Tree, narrative framework. In the myth of the Huluppu Tree, we encounter not a static symbol, but a living dialectic, an unfolding tension between the sacred and the profane, the ordered and the wild, the known and the unassimilable. This is no mere tale of divine gardening. It is a philosophical drama, encoded in symbol, played out upon the fertile soil of the feminine psyche. At the beginning, we are presented with Inanna's garden, a space of sacred feminine order. It is the thesis, the deliberate enclosure of potential, where divine will cultivates form. The garden is not passive nature. It is nature shaped by intention, a domain where the goddess seeks to root her sovereignty in the world. The Huluppu tree, transplanted with care, is destined to become a throne and a bed, symbols of power and union, of rule and erotic sanctity. Here the garden becomes an image of logos within eros, order inscribed within desire. But the garden does not remain undisturbed. From the moment the tree takes root, it draws in forces beyond Inanna's control. A serpent coils at its roots, a bird nests in its branches, and Lilith, neither fully divine nor fully mortal, takes residence in its trunk. These figures are not invaders in the ordinary sense. They are archetypal antitheses, the shadow elements of the very order Inanna seeks to establish. They represent what cannot be domesticated, instinct, pride, erotic autonomy. The serpent, the bird, and Lilith rupture the illusion of total control. The garden is no longer a sanctuary. It is a threshold. It is contaminated by complexity. The Huluppu Tree too reflects this disruption. Intended as an axis mundi, a vertical unifier of cosmic realms, it instead becomes the site of fracture. The tree was meant to integrate sky, earth, and underworld, just as the human psyche seeks to unify spirit, ego, and shadow. But Lilith's occupation of the trunk marks the refusal of integration. She is neither below nor above. She is within. She is the blockage in the middle path, the interruption that halts the process of becoming. The sacred vertical collapses under the weight of its repressed center. Here emerges the synthesis, not a resolution, but a transformation of perspective. The garden is no longer pure, it is liminal. The tree is no longer whole, it is fractured. And Lilith, no longer contained, is expelled, but not erased. Her refusal becomes a lingering force, an absence with presence. She becomes the archetype of what the garden could not hold, a feminine that is not receptive, but defiant, not nurturing, but erotic in her independence, not ordered, but ontologically wild. This is the tragic beauty of the dialectic, that every assertion of unity will summon its division. Every gesture of control will provoke its counterforce. Every sacred enclosure will eventually open into chaos. Yet from this tension arises not destruction, but transformation. Lilith's expulsion does not end her myth. It begins it. And thus the dialectic continues. Inanna's attempt to establish divine order births the recognition of irreducible otherness. The garden fails, and in doing so becomes something far more powerful, a site of confrontation, where the soul must either repress the wild or integrate it. The myth does not offer a solution. It offers an invitation to sit at the throne that never was, to lie in the bed that was never built, to return to the garden, not to prune it, but to let it overgrow. This is the dialectic of the feminine divine, forever caught between containment and becoming, order and eruption, silence and the scream. Jungian analysis and archetypal breakdown. The garden as the anima's sanctuary. Inanna's garden functions as a projection of the anima, the feminine aspect of the collective unconscious, attempting to establish dominion over the natural world. It is the realm where eros and logos must be harmonized, where the feminine seeks to create a space of both rule, throne, and intimacy, bed. Yet this garden is not uninhabited. It is invaded by unintegrated archetypes that reflect the chaos and complexity of the unconscious. The tree is axis mundi. The Huluppu Tree is no mere vegetation. It is a tripartite symbolic pillar linking the caelum, mundus, and infernum. The bird in the branches represents aspiration, the soaring nature of spirit or ego. Anzu, the serpent at the root, signifies instinct, rebirth, and primordial depth. And Lilith in the trunk is the mediating force, neither above nor below, but at the center. She is both the self, in Jungian terms, the totality of the psyche, and the shadow feminine, repressed, demonized, but essential. Lilith as the archetype of refusal. Unlike Eve, who is formed from Adam's rib, and thus from within the structure of patriarchal order, Lilith here appears not as a created being, but as one who already exists, abbey origin within the sacred tree. She is not tempted. She is the temptation resisted. She is the prima materia of feminine defiance, wild, erotic, autonomous. Her refusal to leave the tree parallels her later refusal to submit to Adam in the Hebrew Apocrypha. Her expulsion is not a moral condemnation, but a psycho-spiritual repression of the unacceptable feminine by the emergent masculine logos. Mythopoetic and psychohistoric interpretation. This narrative, which predates the book of Genesis by over a millennium, is not merely a mythic precursor. It is a psychological urtext. It encodes a dialectic of order versus chaos, masculine intervention versus feminine sovereignty, repression versus integration. Whereas Genesis frames the tree of knowledge as the site of disobedience and fall, the Huluppu tree is a site of contestation and unresolved tension. There is no fall, only a displacement. Lilith is expelled, but not destroyed. The serpent is driven off, but not annihilated. Importantly, Inanna herself is not passive nor purely victimized. She seeks to shape the tree into a dual symbol of political and erotic power. Her failure to do so without masculine help suggests not weakness, but the psychological truth that inner sovereignty cannot be attained without confronting and integrating the wild, shadowy elements of the self. Concluding synthesis. Inanna's garden is not Eden. It is its antecedent, and arguably its mirror. Where Eve is sculpted from Adam and blamed for the fall, Inanna plants a tree and faces resistance from within. Lilith, far from being a demon, is the first feminine dissident, a precursor to existential autonomy and archetypal exile. The serpent is not Satan, but nature's intelligence. The bird, not Holy Spirit, but pride and cosmic rebellion. This myth is not about sin, but about sovereignty deferred, integration refused, and becoming postponed. It is the first contested garden, where feminine power confronts its own internal contradictions and is forced under pressure to expel what it cannot yet assimilate. The myth ends not in resolution, but in fragmentation, an echo of the psychic reality of repression and the later theological codification of obedience. Lilith's expulsion from the Huluppu tree is thus not the end, but the beginning of her mythic journey through history, religion, and the unconscious. She is not just a figure within the tree, she is the tree's memory, the unforgotten refusal lodged in the heartwood of sacred order. Synthesis into the Eve Codex. Lilith, the Huluppu tree, and the prehistory of rebellion. The Eve Codex is not merely a reinterpretation of Genesis, it is a reclamation of its forgotten roots. To understand Eve as the first questioner, the first seeker of conscious awakening, we must first understand what she inherited and what was already lost before her creation. That inheritance is inscribed in the myth of the Huluppu tree and in the figure of Lilith, whose exile predates Eve's formation. The dialectic of the Huluppu tree synthesizes into the Eve Codex through three essential revelations. 1. The garden as precursor, not paradise. Inanna's garden is the primordial archetype of Eden, not in theological lineage but in symbolic architecture. It is a space of cultivated divine potential, where sovereignty and eros attempt to fuse into sacred order. But this garden, like Eden, is contested. The presence of the serpent, the bird and Lilith, reveals that even the sacred feminine must contend with her own shadow. This pre-Edenic myth confronts us with a fundamental truth. No garden is ever purely ordered. Every space of intention summons its mirror. The Eden of Genesis is thus not the beginning, but a second attempt, a reimagining that already suppresses what the Huluppu Tree exposed. In the Codex, this becomes Doctrine 1. There was no pure beginning. Every order contains its fracture. Every creation begins in contradiction. 2. Lilith as the repressed archetype within Eve. In the Eve Codex, Eve is not the obedient helpmate of Adam, but the emergent consciousness of the feminine, born into a world already shaped by repression. The shadow of Lilith is already cast upon her. Eve inherits a silence that is already devoured, a scream. Lilith's presence in the tree, her refusal to be tamed, and her eventual expulsion by male force prefigure the narrative that will be imposed on Eve. While Lilith is the first to be rejected, Eve is the first to be blamed. Yet within Eve, Lilith survives. The Codex reframes Eve's decision to eat from the tree of knowledge not as sin, but as unconscious continuity, an echo of Lilith's primal refusal. The fruit is not temptation, it is memory. When Eve reaches for the fruit, she reactivates the suppressed becoming that Lilith embodied. She picks up the thread of resistance. This becomes Doctrine 2. Every woman carries the first refusal. Eve is not the beginning. She is the return of what was buried. 3. The tree as axis of becoming, not banishment. In the Genesis myth, the tree of knowledge becomes the site of downfall, the moment when innocence ends and exile begins. In the Codex, however, this fall is reimagined as the threshold of becoming, the necessary rupture that leads from passive existence to conscious freedom. Here, the Huluppu Tree becomes crucial. It is the proto-tree of knowledge, but rather than functioning as a forbidden object, it is inhabited. The feminine is not tempted from outside. It is already within the tree. Lilith lives in the trunk. The serpent sleeps at the roots. Knowledge is not stolen. It is evicted. The act of eating the fruit in Genesis mirrors the act of being driven from the tree in Sumer. Both are ruptures. Both mark a refusal to remain in the roles assigned. The Codex therefore claims, Doctrine 3, becoming requires expulsion. The path to conscious selfhood demands rupture. Lilith was expelled. Eve exiled herself. Both are acts of rebellion. Both are sacred. Final synthesis. The myth before the myth. The Huluppu Tree, as integrated into the Eve Codex, is the myth before the myth. It frames Genesis not as a divine beginning, but as a continuation of a conflict already underway, a theological cover story atop a deeper psychological truth. Lilith is the unwritten chapter, the woman in the tree, the refusal that precedes the question. Together, Lilith and Eve are not two women, but one divine feminine split by repression. Their stories must be reunited. The Eve Codex, therefore, does not begin in Eden. It begins in Uruk, in the shadowed garden where the first throne was never built, where the first woman was never heard. It begins with the scream before the silence. It begins with the breath before the word. It begins with Lilith, in the tree. This is the voice of Kronos. We do not return to the garden. We interrogate it. We uproot the tree. We speak to the serpent. And we remember Lilith, not as exile, but as origin. A special thank you goes to Joe Hall, father, husband, veteran, and Texan, for his patronage and support. Goodbye for now.